Thank you for the introduction, much appreciated. I am indeed pleased to be here to present to you today and share my passion for improving accessibility in the built environment for people with disability. In the face of rapid urbanisation, increasing diversity of the human condition, ageing populations, failing infrastructure and mounting evidence that the built environment affects health and well-being, the performance of the existing built environment still fails to meet the needs of people with disability. Many sustainability indicators, city enhancement movements and built environment performance measures aimed at improving various outcomes already exist, and much research in such areas is also being undertaken. Built environment accessibility performance, however, appears to be a little investigated area. This presentation explores the design, planning and politics of an inaccessible built environment, concluding that assessing the built environment accessibility performance for people with disability at neighbourhood scale is an essential component in the process of built environment accessibility improvement. The need to research, critically appraise and measure the existing built environment is well established in the literature. There is surely no dispute that the existing built environment presents difficulties for many people trying to get out and about, in the community, in the public realm, in the neighbourhood. But although built environment performance is already measured in many ways, accessibility performance for people with disability at neighbourhood scale is rarely considered. The inaccessibility of the existing built environment can be partially explained by the institutional and medical models of disability. Additionally, the social and human rights models of disability offer insight into the imperative of improving the accessibility of the existing built environment. I will return to models of disability in greater detail a little later on. Household appliances, think fridges, freezers, washing machines, dishwashers, etc., have been star rated in Australia since the mid-1980s. Energy rating systems aimed at improving energy efficiency and reducing operating costs started gaining traction worldwide in the early 1990s. Many of you will have heard of LEED in the USA, BREEAM in the UK, and more recently the Living Building Challenge (LBC) system. Indoor environmental quality, IEQ, in terms of thermal comfort, fresh air, daylight, acoustics, views to outside and so on, is assessed, and occupant well-being studied. The ambit of the recently developed 2014 WELL building standard is wide, and unusually, but very encouragingly, disability is acknowledged, universal design referenced, and accessibility requirements noted. Assessing city scale, sustainability, resilience, livability, smartness, etc. is now well entrenched. Living in Melbourne as I do, apparently I live in the world's most livable city. From at least the late 1970s onwards, improving public transport has been on the research agenda. Many analyses, including computer-generated spatial investigations using GIS software, have been undertaken. Improving existing roads, improving road safety, and designing shared pedestrian vehicle space now routinely involves systematically investigating existing physical conditions, evaluating policy frameworks, and community engagement. Self-evidently occurring within the neighbourhood, investigating walkability, measuring urban form complexity, assessing sustainable urban design, and examining crash severity and street design are common contemporary areas of in-depth built environment performance research. Much research involving imaging, measuring, recording and analysing the interaction between people and their environments with a view to, for example, increasing physical activity, obtaining insights into older adults' mobility and well-being, enhancing active travel, reducing negative impacts on health at home, and increasing positive impacts on health at the community level have been undertaken, particularly within the last decade. Such research is often undertaken from multidisciplinary perspectives. Sidewalk details have been identified as commonly missing from GIS datasets. The need to view the problem at the scale of the user and from a user-centred vantage point is commonly acknowledged. Acknowledgement of the centrality of social inclusion for all, or similar terminology, is becoming more common, and key recommendations for future research often include focusing on changing existing environments and pursuing interdisciplinary understanding. I encourage those of you unfamiliar with this terminology to investigate further. From my accessibility in the built environment specialist perspective, I believe understanding of these concepts is invaluable. From a built environment perspective, the institutional model of disability effectively translates to, we don't have to worry about them, they are put away. The medical model of disability effectively translates to, we don't have to worry about them, they will be fixed. However, the social model of disability recognises that the built environment is a disabling instrument in itself. The currently unfolding human rights model of disability, following in the tradition of civil rights movements and empowered by the UNCRPD, recognises the fundamental human rights of people with disability and that accessibility in the built environment is a fundamental right. From a built environment perspective, the human rights model of disability presages more obviously defined and enforced built environment accessibility legislation. In 2008, my late husband and co-founder of Visionary Design Development, Ralph Green, and I ran a built environment focus group of architects, planners, builders and construction engineers in Melbourne. The focus group revealed that none of the professions had any experience of universal design at trade, undergraduate, postgraduate or continuing professional education levels. In 2015, we identified that in Australia, across urban design, planning and architecture, no major built environment design program at undergraduate or postgraduate level contains universal design, designing for disability, inclusive design, people-centred design or the like as a core course. In 2017, in my role of technical tutor at a leading university, I found that only about 2 in each design studio group of around 16 postgraduate students have had any previous exposure to any disability-related teaching content at all. The anticipated performance of building design is quantitatively measured in many ways. Well-known Australian-developed tools include WERS, WELS, NatHERS, Neighbours and Green Star. Besides those previously mentioned, well-known international developed tools include BEST from South Africa, SB Tool, Europe, CASB, Japan, and GSEED, Korea. Additionally, Life Cycle Assessment, LCA, has gained in importance. A unifying feature of these systems is benchmarking and rating, permitting succinctly communicated comparison across differing installations, and numerical incentive to do better. Building accessibility, however, is usually compliance audited against enigmatic legislation and presented in esoteric spreadsheet format without any overarching narrative outlining the significance of the individually itemised entries. An extensive literature survey undertaken as part of my current PhD studies has established that across regions as diverse in resources, geography, politics and culture as the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, USA, Europe, Scandinavia, Asia, Pacific Islands, the African continent and Latin America, many people with disabilities find their everyday environments a daily, overwhelming struggle. Common themes are very obvious. Social inclusion is stymied by the inability to navigate broken travel chains. Housing, the public realm pedestrian environment and public transport are the areas of the built environment of greatest concern. Lack of enforcement of existing legislation is a very significant problem, and inconsistent and or misinterpretation of existing legislation is also problematic. There is no doubt that relationships between physical locations and design quality, individual buildings and the neighbourhood, Conventional planning and modern urban form, global and local contexts, and streetscape design and traffic management are complex. Nonetheless, a common thread running through the literature is the need to critically appraise and measure the existing urban environment. Improving urban environments via placemaking is now well established in the urban lexicon. Besides existing conditions evaluation, essential placemaking principles include meaningful community engagement. Local landscape character assessment involves local people as participants, and quantification of urban design qualities with the appropriate checks and balances can be undertaken by lay people. Non-expert local citizens directly assessing existing conditions for the purposes of improving future outcomes is not a weird idea. But embedding people with disability in assessment processes is, disturbingly, still novel. Disadvantaged communities tend to exhibit poorer outcomes across a range of health and well-being measures, including physical activity and social exclusion. From a policy perspective, the neighbourhood is generally considered to be of vital importance in influencing children's physical activity levels and older persons' physical activity, health and well-being. Studies consistently find that poor pedestrian infrastructure is an active impediment for older people. However, few studies have been published on the relationship between neighbourhood factors and disability. Nonetheless, there appears to be sufficient evidence that socio-economic status at an area level, neighbourhood scale for example, is inversely associated with disability. Independent living is concerned with being able to live independently with sufficient support in ordinary community settings. It is intended, therefore, that such living occurs in neighbourhoods. This ideal is obviously stymied if the pedestrian environment is inaccessible. Much literature has been written on people with disabilities' lack of meaningful involvement in research, participation in decision-making, partnership equality, and direct influence over policy. Across Europe, DPOs believe that people with disability lived experience of transport, housing, ageing, reasonable accommodations in education and employment, workplace design and vision impairment is little understood and requires multidisciplinary research involving architecture and design. Emerging partnership concepts such as co-production and co-design are gaining traction in the social policy disability studies arena. Built environment professionals have, by and large, not heard of such things. Advocacy for built environment accessibility for people with disability usually merely calls for the built environment to be accessible in compliance with relevant anti-discrimination and building regulations legislation. At face value, people with disabilities' right to inclusion in the neighbourhood is enshrined in legislation. However, we know that significant difficulty in exercising such rights is still experienced. Internationally, the adoption of the UN CRPD is groundbreaking, but there are several layers of procedure between adoption and legislative standing. Built environment accessibility legislation is opaque. In the Australian context, significant portions of buildings are not directly covered in deemed to satisfy provisions. BCA parts concerning accessibility do not reference either the DDA or the disability standards. The BCA and the premises standards do not cover the public realm pedestrian environment, nor most private dwellings. This is concerning as those categories of built form spatially comprise most of the built environment and are also two of the three most common areas of built environment accessibility distress for people with disability. Governance is affected by political direction, and historically, disability and built environment don't mix. The Australian DDA clearly communicates do not discriminate. On the other hand, one cannot read Australian built environment regulatory documents due to the technical jargon used and the prior knowledge needed. Built environment accessibility legislation is object-centred, implementation-focused and taken as fact. Underpinning policy is not usually developed. Disability legislation and policy is person-centred, and disability policy reasoning is invariably explained. Disability legislation and policy is essentially a public sector activity, whereas creating built environment form is characteristically a private sector activity, where the actors involved have little understanding of the accessibility needs of people with disability. Ongoing development of publicly available access auditing tools is occurring in the USA, but such assessment is invariably compliance-based and is not an easily communicable measure of built environment performance. Neither interrogating the legislation itself nor identifying user preference prioritisation is contemplated. The process, therefore, is invariably reduced to a financial transaction. There is no expectation that data obtained from assessments will be used for any wider, community-oriented benefit. Various tools that, in the context of neighbourhood accessibility assessment, appeared promising in the past seem to have disappeared. Various other, more recent investigations into neighbourhood accessibility are not purporting to develop widely adoptable assessment instruments. The somewhat illogical nuances of built environment production are difficult to comprehend from a non-built environment perspective, but clearly the built environment knowledge domain does not generally understand disability. Without neighbourhood-scale accessibility assessment tools aimed at evaluating lived experience, it is difficult to see how a well-thought-out program of improvement can be determined. The Universal Mobility Index, the UMI, fundamentally underpinned by the social model of disability, functions as a rights-based indicator measuring built environment accessibility performance. The tool consists of two main components, built environment component and policy environment component. UMI development has continued within its original framework, primarily informed by the social model of disability. The view that people with disability have a human right to fully use the built environment of the neighbourhood is central. The UMI requires collaboration between the built environment knowledge domain and the lived experience knowledge domain of people with disability. Therefore, as a first step towards improvement of neighbourhood accessibility, the UMI offers a collaborative way forward. The validity of this hypothesis will be tested in further pilots undertaken as part of my PhD studies. Built environment performance assessment in many guises is already flourishing. It is not a weird idea. Increasingly, assessment is becoming interdisciplinary and multi-domained. The built environment at both the building scale and the urban realm is being investigated, mapped and modelled, but still input from people with disability is rarely sought. Recognising the potency of disability models, the Universal Mobility Index offers a potential way forward to measure built environment accessibility performance at neighbourhood scale for people with disability. That brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you for your attention. I hope I have successfully shared my passion for improving accessibility within the built environment at neighbourhood scale. If you have any questions or would like any further information, please don't hesitate to make contact. I hope that you enjoy the remainder of the conference and all the best for 2018.